coming down to this resolution. It's just the important thing. And I think it's something that we've been trying to, for the last 10 years, to say that like intersex people are not different from anyone else. We are human, just like you. We are not a special kind of humans. We are just humans. And we, as humans, we deserve human rights, and intersex rights are human rights.
Making Rainbow Waves, a podcast by ILGA World. Welcome everybody to Making Rainbow Waves, a podcast by ILGA World in which we tell the stories of LGBTI human rights defenders worldwide. My name is Daniele Paletta, and today is a very special episode because we usually have only one person that I speak to, and this time we have four. And actually in the same room and not in a virtual meeting, so this is really amazing. Welcome to all of you, and I will maybe briefly ask you to introduce yourselves for your audience.
Sure. Hi, I'm Kimberly Zieselman. I'm an intersex human rights defender and an intersex woman. I am currently working as a senior advisor for intersex global rights for Outright International, and am delighted to be a part of this podcast today, hosted by ILGA World.
Right. Hello, everyone. My name is Obioma Chukwuike. I'm from Nigeria, and I work with Intersex Nigeria as Executive Director. I'm glad to be part of this podcast today, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Hello everyone, my name is Kaisli Syrjänen. I'm an intersex activist from Finland. I'm the chair of Intersex Human Rights Finland, ISIO, and a board member of OIA Europe. Good to be here.
Hi everyone, my name is Hendricks. I'm an intersex woman and intersex human rights defender from South Africa. I am the Sex Characteristics Programs of ILGA World, and I'm happy to be here today.
Thank you very much. So, as all of you heard, I'm together with four intersex human rights defenders today. We are in Geneva in a beautiful sunny day, which is almost coming to a close. And the reasons that we are here in Geneva is because the Human Rights Council is working on a resolution explicitly dedicated to combating violence, discrimination, and harmful practices against intersex persons. And my understanding is that this is an absolute first. So I'm going to ask you if you can explain to our audience what does the resolution mandate and why it is important that this is happening.
I can jump in. The resolution will mandate that the UN Office of the High Commissioner issue a report and hold a formal report, which has not been done before, and hold an expert panel. The reason that this is important is it's another step in the UN processes for achieving recognizable human rights for intersex persons globally.
How did we get to this resolution? I know there's been a pathway, let's say, in how intersex human rights have been discussed within United Nations spaces. Could you give us a history of how we got to this point?
Yeah, sure. So there's been a history of intersex activism at the Human Rights Council and within the UN space, starting from 2015. So in 2015, the UN member states, mostly pushed by civil society, have increased their attention around the human rights violations that intersex people faces. In 2015, we saw the OHCHR that convened the first ever intersex expert meetings, and Kimberly was a part of that meeting. And we were talking about that it's actually 10 years later. So we saw in 2016 a group of human rights experts and mechanisms, as well as from the African Commission of Human and People's Rights and the Council of Europe, issue a joint statement urging to end violence and harmful medical practices against intersex people. And what we can see with the timeline is that nothing has been very different from, what this resolution is asking for and calling for. In 2019, we also saw the OHCHR publish a background note that focused on specific human rights violations that intersex people are facing. And I think what has been so important and essential when we look at this timeline is that intersex people have really been holding the narrative, and we've been given an opportunity to ensure that our voices are with whatever report, whatever statement has come up. And I think we've been following this notion about nothing about us without us. And maybe someone else wants to add further.
Yeah, I will jump in there to say that thank you, Crystal, for the background, and also this also shows the visibility of the work that the intersex human rights activists has been doing around the globe. It also shows the similarities of the context of our challenges, our issues that we face in different contexts, be it in the global south or the global north. It also shows that there is a need for an important step to be taken to protect intersex persons from the different forms of discrimination, violations, and misinformation that has been flying around about what our body really means. So it calls for bodily autonomy, self-determination, integrity of our body, which is very important and the core point of what we advocate as intersex persons. So I feel that this resolution is long overdue and it should be happening at this point. It also shows that the efforts of intersex advocates and activists around the globe is not a waste, and whatever we are fighting for is a just cause, and it's time for us to be upheld in a very important state as the UN is doing right now. So I think it's something that we have been hoping for a very long time. We have had conversations about it, we have dreamt about it, and this is the first start of our utopia. So I'm happy to see that this is happening, and I hope that it doesn't just stop at the resolution, the implementation takes place after the resolution is passed.
It's really fascinating to see like how much time it can actually take to get from one thing to this resolution. 10 years is a very long time, right? And especially when we talk things that impact people's daily lives. And I think there also needs to be an explanation of why these matters. Because usually, if I'm thinking of people outside the activist circles, they think of the UN as something that's very remote, maybe not useful on an immediate practical level, and we know of course that that is not the case. So how would you explain why this resolution actually matters for everyone and not just for us who are here doing the advocacy work?
I think that's like a really big thing that UN gives some guidelines which really encourages or can encourage states to have national legislation. And that would directly impact people's lives.
And we're already seeing a core group of states pushing for these resolutions. So, do you have a message for them?
I think the message for the Intersex core group is a huge thank you. And I think we all sigh a little bit, we all sort of breathe a sigh of relief when we see member states like the core group really step up and articulate our issues and defend our issues, because we're not used to having other people, particularly people in such powerful positions, defend our human rights. So for me, it's very meaningful.
And I think it's also important having allies, but allies that still allow intersex people to hold the narrative. I think we've been working with the core group since last year when they released the first statement asking for the adopting of this resolution. And then we also saw civil society groups also releasing a statement for the adoption of this resolution. But what I can say about the four states in the core group is that they've ensured to have continuous communication with the intersex groups. They've allowed the intersex groups to, in a way, formulate the resolution for us to provide input and for us to make sure that the language that gets used in the resolution also leads us, to safety as intersex people. Because we've seen resolutions that actually has been more problematic than, that it didn't really have good influence on states because of language in the resolution. And I think with the core group working with us, and I mean, we are so grateful for the core group, is that they've really allowed us, to lend our voice, because we are intersex people. We face this violence, we face this discrimination. So I feel like there's no one better than us to speak on these issues. But I feel like the process has been a process of inclusivity, where even though we do not have the authority, to sit at the UN and really speak to states all the time, but to have these people that are in allies, but also allies that are leaning on us, not allies that is in a way trying to take away from your voice, but allies is actually including your voice in the conversation. And I feel like that is so important for intersex people.
Yeah, and I mean to contribute to the previous question about what does it mean for other persons who are not intersex. I think this is actually the most important part of it, because for us as intersex persons, we understand our body, we understand our issues. But for people out there who are not intersex, they may not understand the need to protect and promote intersex rights. And that is why this resolution is very important, because right now it's going to look at it holistically from the intersections of intersex issues, how it affects us in different, including the SDGs that the UN is very big on. So I think the resolution also calls for how we have been marginalized for years, and also how it will protect intersex that are yet unborn, because intersex is not stopping now. It's something that will continue to happen. Intersex birth is still going to happen till tomorrow. So I think it's important that this resolution highlights the importance to specifically address the issues of marginalization, discrimination, and harmful practices that intersex persons have faced over the years, and how we can actually collectively ensure that intersex persons are incorporated into different systems that have structurally discriminated us over the years. So I think it's important, not just for the intersex persons, but for everyone at large, to understand how they can play a part to protect and promote intersex rights.
And yeah, I was actually wondering, how do you think the awareness around intersex human rights is at the moment? Because, as you were saying, Crystal, there has been lots of international and human rights mechanism, even at the regional level, that have spoken up about intersex issues. And there are more states that have established legal protections. To date, 9 states worldwide have nationwide restrictions on interventions on intersex minors. And there are a few who officially protect against discrimination in health settings based on sex characteristics. So it looks like, from an outside perspective, that things are moving forward. But I was wondering, what do you think about how is the general public and even the LGBTI community at large aware of what intersex means? And if it's still not enough, what can be done to make this awareness grow?
Yeah, and I think we were having this conversation, and I was telling Kimberly, Obioma, and Kaisli that we still have so much work to do, because we've seen the advancement of intersex rights, and we are seeing that more people are becoming aware of the violations that intersex people face, but there's still a huge lack of awareness around intersex issues. I mean, we could be publicly on national TV, or and you could still walk into a room and people don't know that you are intersex, and they don't understand anything the intersex community is facing. And I think we've been seeing in the last few years, people have been trying this whole intersectional approach when it comes to intersex rights, saying that, like, the same as how female genital mutilation is a feminist issue, intersex rights is also a feminist issue. The same way as feminists speak about forced sterilization, do we not see that intersex children are also being forcefully sterilized by having healthy sexually reproductive organs removed from their body? So it's like intersex issues, it's a human rights issue, and there's so many intersections that we can work on these issues, but we also don't see a lot of groups coming together. We don't see feminist groups coming to the intersex groups and say, how can we help you, how can we raise more awareness, and how can we support you? And even within the LGBT community, like, there's also a big lack of knowledge. Like, most of us attend regional and global conferences, and sometimes there's just no conversation around intersex, and you find intersex people speaking to intersex people about our issues. And in my thinking, it's like, so how are we advancing this? Because we are speaking to each other. We should be speaking to the broader community. We need to speak to feminist groups, to women rights groups, to children's rights groups. We need to speak to this thing of bodily autonomy is essential for intersex people, just how it is for feminists, for children, for women, for everyone that's being marginalized. And I also feel like we are also challenged. Like, how do we start having these conversations? Because I'm also tired of intersex people speaking to intersex people about our issues.
Preach. I mean, everything Crystal said and more. I do think that is one of the most important next steps for our movement, is because the issue is so intersectional, to actually be more intersectional in our advocacy work and have more allies from the feminist movements, from the children's rights movements, from the women's movements. And I think we're starting to see some progress. I've noticed in Europe, some of the coalitions against female genital mutilation and cutting FGM are starting to embrace and collaborate with the intersex communities around intersex genital mutilation. I think that's an excellent sign of progress because there are so many similarities, and this is an issue of bodily autonomy. So I think, yes, I think in not just talking to each other, but talking to other organizations, activists, and people with a platform to raise the issues around intersex genital mutilation and other forms of intersex violence and discrimination is really, really important.
I have to say, again, from an outsider perspective, but I've also witnessed the same conferences, how, like, after a while, there seems to be groups that are already grouped by, I mean, identity is not a term that refers to intersex people, but like as a broad term, I mean...
Experience, maybe. They group together by experience. And I wonder if this is something that some of the international human rights organizations, LGBTQI plus organizations could do, is be more intentional about integrating when there are conferences or there are webinars, being more intentional and having like a designed interaction between different groups of people. Because education is needed. I mean, we all need to learn from each other. And I know even in the most well-meaning LGBTQ plus spaces, there's still a lot of, there's a lack of understanding around what intersex is. And I think a hesitancy to get involved because of not understanding what it is and wanting to do the right thing. So I feel like educating our allies, even within the LGBTQ plus space, is really important still on intersex.
Coming back to the resolution, yeah, I was positively surprised by the text. There's a passage, and there has been since the beginning actually, that mention misinformations and disinformation among the root causes of the harmful practices against intersex people. And as I was telling you, of course, as a communication person, I heard speaking about misinformation and disinformation and my brain went ding. So it was really interesting to see, because I think we're all seeing across the world how the anti-gender movement is pushing for bills and policy initiatives that target trans people, but impact on intersex people as well. And the impact on the intersex community is very, very rarely recognized. And actually, intersex issues are often instrumentalized by those defending those bills, right? There was a report by Interact, an organization in the US, that had this very effective sentence I found. It said, the core belief of the anti-gender opposition is that transgender people must be prevented from changing their bodies, while intersex people must be prevented from keeping theirs, which is something that I found really enlightening and so on point, unfortunately. So I was wondering whether you can elaborate on that and on all the impact that this is having on your community.
I mean, I can speak a little bit coming from the United States and what's been happening in the US over the last couple of years with a wave of state level anti-trans bills, and specifically laws that are being passed banning gender affirming care for transgender youth that are specifically carving out exceptions, or I should say including exceptions for intersex babies and children. So in other words, a lot will be banning doctors from providing gender affirming care that a trans youth wants and needs, but is specifically in the same bill stating it's okay to do genital mutilation or irreversible surgeries on intersex infants and children. So it's actually the anti-trans movement, if you will, and the legislation and the push against gender affirming care for trans youth has in some ways lifted the intersex issue to the surface in the United States because of these bills specifically noting intersex, but not in a good protective way, in a way that, just as you stated, is very much like, we don't want you to have this body that is not typical or, in their eyes, not normal. And I think that's what it is. It's all about kind of controlling bodies and controlling the narrative about what is normal, what's healthy, and what's acceptable. And this is what's happening in the United States and around the world to the transgender community, to the intersex community, and let's be honest, to women everywhere. The common theme here is control over bodies and a lack of bodily autonomy. So this is much larger than just an intersex issue. This is an anti-gender, anti-rights, I think anti-women movement globally that really requires all of us to work together to push back against.
Yeah, and I also think with the movement, and I think we've been seeing it a lot with the anti-gender movement. When it comes to intersex people, is that they really want to pathologize our bodies, right? Like, even we see languages such as disorder of sexual development, and it's in a way proving like we're using us as tokens to say, if we can fix these people and assign them a sex or a gender, this is something that could be done to anyone, right? So it's putting the notion out there that we can normalize intersex people's bodies, and if we can do that, then how can we not like normalize the entire world? And that is the actual notion that was going on, and that's the big debate. And as intersex activists, we're like, we should be part of the conversation around the anti-gender and anti-rights movement, because intersex people always had their bodily autonomy stripped away. Intersex people always didn't have a voice around their self-determination about who they are as an intersex person. And these surgeries has been happening for years and years and years. And a lot of intersex people have not dealt with a lot of physical problems related to this, but also like around their gender and around expressing themselves and who they are. And it's so essential that even though like the trans experience, like being trans and being intersex is completely different from who you are. Being intersex has nothing to do with your sexuality. It has nothing to do with your gender identity. When being trans is directly about someone's gender identity, about who they, believe that they are and who they are. But somehow there's this intersecting where people confuse the things of trans and intersex people. But like now what we are seeing in the US with the bills that are saying no surgeries for trans youth, but the same bills will say, but if you are born with a variation of whatever sex characteristics, then we could still perform surgery on you. So it's almost like they're putting us up against each other as well. And I feel like in the movement, we also, have to be careful. Like I always say, like, trans rights is also a feminist issue, the same as intersex rights. And at some point we meet each other, especially when it comes to legal gender recognition, because intersex people faces the same problems as trans people. Also, when it comes to gender affirming healthcare, like I've spoken to Kimberly and I'm like, there's no adult care for intersex people. Like they will have surgeries performed when you are a child and they just let you go. And now you are this person growing up in this intersex body, but there's no healthcare. Like you don't know really what to do and there's no options for you. And we see the similar thing happening in the trans movement. So when I look at the anti-rights and anti-gender movement, it's like Kimberly says, like it's not only just targeting trans people, it's targeting intersex people, but it's also targeting women, trying to strip away their bodily autonomy. So I also feel there's a bigger conversation we need to have to come together and talk about the anti-rights and the anti-gender movement.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I think speaking of the anti-rights or anti-human rights movements on how they try to control, because if you look at it from the broader view, it's about controlling what you should look like because of the binaries, the binary notion of black and white. And it also makes me wonder how we actually think that in a world that is as diverse as people are, not just people, even plants and animals, how then do you decide for people how their body should look like? Because if you look at the irreversible surgeries, the medicalization of intersex bodies, nobody speaks about the effects, the impacts. They only speak about how to fix the body. Nobody wants to ask you, how do you feel? I've met a lot of intersex children who have undergone these surgeries, and I see them and I know what what their lives will look like. Even though I cannot tell them because I don't want to make them lose hope. But when their parents ask me, is it ever going to be all right? I don't have an answer for them. And I think that is the bigger conversation about the consequences of what we don't want that they are forcing on us. Meanwhile, there are a group of persons that want this for themselves, that have chosen that they want this for themselves. They are not giving them the right to do what they want to do. So for me, I think it's about robbing Peter to pay Paul. But at the sense of it, it's destabilizing the two communities. It's making the two communities lose their purpose and ownership of their body. And if we're talking about human rights not being indivisible, why are we dictating for a group of persons that have said that these particular procedures is harmful to our body? These particular procedures leaves us with lifetime effects that affect not just our medical situation or status, but the whole life. Because if you look at the chain reaction of what the surgeries, the medicalization, the harmful practices does to you, it doesn't only affect you medically, it affects you socially. It excludes you from having families, it excludes you from having relationship, it excludes you from having even employment or even education. Because I've met intersex children who are no longer in school because of the complications from these surgeries. So I think the conversation should be about how do we look beyond what we want and look at what the people that actually face these experiences need. The ownership of these issues is what we should be looking at. And I think that is why this resolution is very important because, like I said earlier, it's not just about the community now, but it's about the wider society understanding the impact and consequences of some of these harmful practices and violations on our bodies.
I would like to add here the perspective of children's rights. In my national organization, our main cooperation is with three biggest children's rights organizations, and that really leads the discussion to some other levels, not just about it's about children's rights issue simply.
But I also just think like coming down to this resolution is just the important thing, and I think it's something that we've been trying to for the last 10 years to say that like intersex people are not different from anyone else. We are human, just like you. We are not a special kind of humans. We are just humans, and we as humans we deserve human rights, and intersex rights are human rights. So I feel like we are at this big stepping stone, and regardless of all the everything that we face around anti-gender movement, around our bodies being pathologized, our bodies being medicalized, all the discrimination, the stigma that we go through as intersex people. I think the important thing is that we need this resolution at the UN to be used as an advocacy tool in one sense, but also just to use as a tool to say that intersex people are here, we exist, and we also deserve human rights. And I think that is so essential and important. Yeah.
And we're not asking for special rights.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the other thing. We're not asking for anything unique or special. We're just asking for human rights like everybody else.
Yeah, I always tell people like sometimes I wish I could just exist.
Yeah.
Like, I just want to like other people, I see them walking and just existing. Like, I just want to be like, I don't want to be questioned. I don't want to be
It's also a burden as a human rights defender, as an intersex human rights defender, to always be the one in the room talking about this, to be, fighting against it, telling our own stories over and over again. There's a real huge emotional price that we all pay. And that's another reason for needing allies too. I'm a big believer in the importance of allies in our movement. Intersex informed, ideally intersex led but supported by allies is so, so important for many
So true.
reasons.
Yeah.
So that's my call to action to all you listeners out there in podcast land. Please become allies. We need your support, including the trans movement. The trans movement also, I'm going to say this, and it's maybe a bit controversial, but I think they need to step up. You know, I see, at least in the United States, I used to run Interact. You mentioned Interact earlier. And they're reaching out and being very inclusive of their intersex siblings in the United States and collaborating. And I think that's a really great thing. I also want to see the more well-funded and powerful trans organizations do the same back to the intersex communities, because I think we're better together.
Yeah. And I think I think I can't leave this out of the conversation, but if we speak about stepping up, then my call to action is also to donors, and to funders. Intersex people are the most underfunded group because we don't have funding. You know, we only have so little resources to have 4 people at the UN at this important and vital time. We were supposed to have funding to have, like at least 20 to 25 activists taking up space, talking to states, changing the narrative, letting them see that intersex people exist. But because funding is so limited for intersex organizing, I really want donors to step up and not just, speak on it, but actually implement and make sure there's funding available for intersex groups. And also understanding that intersex groups are also very small. So our organizations is not often set up like your standard LGBTQI organizations, but also to meet us where we are at, because I feel sometimes the process of applying for funding can be so difficult and daunting for intersex organizing that intersex people give up, at the end of the day. So my call to action is to donors to also fund intersex groups, but also meet intersex groups where they are at and make sure that your funding can be flexible, your application process is flexible, and, just meet intersex people where they are at.
100%.
100%.
Like, give us money.
Nothing about us without us. So we can't be left out. And I think it's just like the resolution, it's high time that everyone, including the funders, step up in their game to include intersex, led and focused projects and programs, because it's not that we don't appreciate the fact that sometimes they lump us into other larger LGBTQI programs or projects, but we want something that we can use to address some of these issues that we have talked about in this podcast.
Unique issues.
Unique issues. We also are allies and support other groups, but sometimes we need to speak about some of the issues that we face. And it's very vital that donors actually step up. It's one thing that we have been saying for years now. I see changes, but I think we can do better. That's my take. I think the donors can do better, and I know they can do better. And I also think that it's important that we realize that we cannot be on the same capacity, just like you mentioned, Crystal, with other organizers or other spectrums that have been organizing for years. We are trying to build a movement, and we have been trying so hard with the little resources that we can grab. Imagine if we're given access to more resources, what we can do. So I think it's about opening up more spaces for us and allowing us to grow too. Because sometimes I hear funders say, you don't have the capacity to do this, but I cannot have the capacity if I'm not doing that. I can't just sit and have the capacity. I have to assess some funds to start having the capacity. So who is going to give me that funds? Capacity building is very important for us, and that is what we need right now.
And that's also a question of the misinformation and disinformation, lack of awareness and understanding. If there is not enough funding, there is not enough information out there.
Exactly.
It's really the moment for me as a person who's not part of the intersex community to commend what you've done. Because again, as you said, you are very small groups and you've really been moving mountains. And the fact that in 10 years it's gone from grassroots activisms that continues alongside this, and that's still the biggest part of what you do, I guess. But it's gone from there up to the United Nations and on having a resolution approved. I mean, this is really moving mountains. And I'm very sure about that, but maybe tell me if I'm wrong. But this is also comes at a very high emotional cost for you. Because, I mean, you're here in the room with me after a very long day of speaking with people who has not always been friendly and kind, right? And you're still here talking to me and talking about your work and your personal experiences. And this is about your personal life, right? Like, it's a lot. So, I'm not sure people tell this to you enough, but please let me. You all deserve a shout for what you're doing.
Thank you. And I think when we were just finished in the room, I said something and I told someone from one of the states that it's difficult being in this room, but it's also important to be in this room, because I've always lived with the notion if I could change one intersex person's life, and if they don't have to go through all the trauma that I've gone through, I feel like I've done my work on this earth. And I think it's so important that many others are not afforded the opportunity where they can fight for their rights. So while we have this privilege and we have this opportunity, it's important for us to do it. But it's also important for us to go back and take care of ourselves and make sure that self-care is a priority. Take a moment, step away, and come back to fight another day.
I think we're coming to the close of our conversation today. And I just wanted to thank you so much again for being here. I wanted to close with the last question, which is, what happens next with the resolution being passed? Like, now what? And how does intersex civil society, grassroots groups, and allies maybe even, how can they all get involved at this point?
I mean, there are many ways they can get involved, because the resolution is passed. The next step is implementation, because the resolution is a text, a binding text. It's call to action, more or less. So it's about how do member states start acting on the resolution, including the ones that voted and did not vote for it. That is the bigger picture, because we're not hoping that it's only the people that voted for it that will implement it in their country, but also people that did not vote for it should understand that there is a need, because this is a human rights call. And also, it also calls for more grassroots mobilization, development of legislations, laws, policies that can protect and also bring out the issues at the grassroots level. So I think it's about how we can pick the pieces from what the resolution have said to use it as a national advocacy tool and also a global advocacy tool. And I also think this is where the work actually begins, because now we have been given a mandate to go into the world and, continue to advocate. And it's also more work for us as activists to actually organize more and also find ourselves in spaces where we have not been before, conversing for allyship with other groups to also speak about these issues and also bring out solutions, sustainable solutions that can actually, better the lives of intersex persons around the globe. So I think it's more about taking it to the next level after the resolution is passed.
I also think it affords us really an opportunity within society. I think, especially if someone coming from Africa, being intersex has always been seen as a curse or a bad omen, or there's something negative on the family, and that's why your child has been born intersex. And also, I'll give a trigger warning, but in many instances, being intersex has also led to the infanticide, and that's the killing of intersex children. And I think when we saw the resolution 552 at the African Commission of Human and People's Rights, it was an acknowledgement that intersex people exist and we are part of the community and we are part of the society. And that was just so important. Like, we are not a bad omen. We are not a curse. We are human, just like everyone else. And I think this resolution is another tool for us to use within our advocacy. And even though it might not be binding, but we can hold our states accountable to say that this is what the UN calls for, because we know that intersex people are not included in many things. If we look at the sustainable development, like even the LGBTQI is not mentioned there, but we look on SDG 3 on good health and well-being. When our countries do statistics, they don't include intersex people when they speak about sexual health rights and sexual reproductive health rights. Like, we are not mentioned, right? And being intersex, IgM, these surgeries that happen, it's linked directly to sexual reproductive health rights, but we are not mentioned. And I feel like this now gives us an opportunity to take from the human rights perspective, but also then merging it with sustainable development. And then as intersex people, we could then go to our states, and hold them accountable and have conversations. So this resolution has been implemented. What are you going to do about it, right? Speak to our states and have conversation. And also, we are exciting for the mandate on the report to be developed by the OHCHR, because also intersex activism, it's been 10 years at the UN, but for others, they've been doing this for longer than 10 years. But also we have so little tools because we've been so underfunded. And I feel like every tool that we could get is essential for us to, successfully advocate in actually obtaining this world where intersex people are protected. So for me, I'm like, how intersex groups, grassroots groups, like any high-level groups, they will be able to use the report from the OHCHR, tackle that to their own national activities, what's happening, and hold their states accountable. So I feel like we are building the toolbox for intersex advocacy, and now it's not just coming from intersex organizing, but it's coming from the UN. And, so I feel like it adds more power, even though it's not binding, but it will be a powerful tool that we could use to make our states aware and to make the world aware that we exist. We are 1.7% of the population. There's millions of intersex people. You cannot deny that. And now the UN has recognized us. So what more do you need? Now we need to be protected. Yeah.
It's really wonderful to feel the energy in all what you say and the power and the commitment that you all put into your work. So I just wanted to thank you once again for having been here. It's getting dark outside and in this room as well. So I really just wanted to thank you very, very much for all the work that you're doing and for having me here with you today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Making Rainbow Waves is a podcast by ILGA World. This episode was hosted by Daniele Paletta and edited by Daia Ponzio. You can find every episode on all streaming platforms. A transcription of this episode in English and its translations to Spanish are available on ilga.org. Thanks for listening.